Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown Opens the Locked Room, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown Finds Death. Waiting. The first thing Father Brown noticed was that the dead man was smiling as if he had been waiting for him, as if he knew Father Brown would be the one to find him, as if the whole thing had been arranged like an appointment neither of them had agreed to, but both somehow kept. The smile was not one of peace, but of a terrible private amusement, the kind a man wears when he has seen something that no one else will ever understand, and intends to take that secret to the grave. It was early evening, the rain clinging to the stones of Kembleford's narrow lanes, when Father Brown was summoned to the old railway station. The trains hadn't run here for years, but the building still stood in its skeletal ruin, a place the children dared each other to enter and the grown-ups pretended didn't exist. It was Mrs. McCarthy who brought the message, a breathless knock at the Yigso presbytery door, her eyes wide, her voice trembling with something between fear and disbelief. "Father, there's a man. He's— Oh, dear God, you must come." She could hardly speak the rest. He followed her without asking further questions, his cassock brushing through the wet grass as the station's looming shadow emerged from the mist. The body was in the ticket office, seated in the corner as if waiting for a train that would never arrive. The rain had blown through the broken windows, leaving damp trails across the dust-covered floor. His clothes were neat, pressed, the kind a man might wear for a meeting of great importance. But the strangest thing, apart from the smile, was the fact that he held a railway ticket between two fingers, poised delicately as if about to hand it to an invisible conductor. The destination on the ticket was blank. Inspector Mallory was already there, pacing like a caged animal, his face tight with irritation. There's no sign of struggle, no wounds, no theft, and nobody in the village recognizes him. His voice dropped almost reluctantly. We don't even know if he died here, or if someone brought him here for whatever this is. His eyes flicked to the ticket, then away, as though it unsettled him to look at it for too long. Father Brown knelt beside the body, his gaze resting on the smile. "This man," he said softly, "was expecting me." Mallory stared at him, unblinking. "You've gone mad, Father. You've never seen him before in your life." But Father Brown didn't answer. He was looking at the man's shoes, polished to a perfect shine, and at the faint trace of mud caught in the grooves of the sole. Mud that was far too red for Kembleford's soil. Mud from somewhere else entirely. The villagers began to gather outside, whispering in the drizzle, their faces pale. They spoke of seeing the man the night before, sitting on a bench near the church, staring at the tower's clock as if counting down to something. Others swore they had never seen him at all. Mrs. McCarthy for once was silent. She just stood in the doorway clutching her bag, her eyes fixed on the dead man's expression, as if afraid he might suddenly speak. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere thickened. The smell of damp wood, old paper, and something faintly metallic hung in the air. Father Brown's eyes moved to the wall opposite the body, where an ancient timetable still clung in tatters. One of the listings was circled, not in pen, but with a finger dragged, through the dust. The time was 8:07, no date, no train number, just that one strange hour. He rose slowly, brushing off his knees. "Inspector," he murmured, "there's a reason he's smiling, and there's a reason he's holding that ticket. But I think the truth is worse than we want it to be." Mallory's irritation sharpened into something else, a tension he couldn't quite disguise. "Worse how?" he demanded. But Father Brown only looked at the empty space beyond the broken window, as though something, or someone, stood there, watching. That night, sleep refused to come. The rain had stopped, but the silence was heavier than any storm. Father Brown sat in the presbytery study, the railway ticket lying on the desk before him. He had examined it under the lamp. The card was old, far older than the station's closure. The blank destination wasn't an oversight. It had been deliberately erased, the fibres of the paper rough where the ink had been lifted. On the back, barely visible, was a tiny mark, 3 lines intersecting in the shape of an uneven cross. The next morning he walked to the church. The doors were unlocked as always, but the air inside was strange, still expectant. On the front pew, someone had left a small package wrapped in brown paper. No note. Inside was a pocket watch, stopped at precisely 8:07, the same time from the dust-marked timetable. The glass of the watch was cracked, as if it had been struck, or as if something inside had tried to break its way out. He told no one about the watch. Not yet. But he kept it in his pocket that day, feeling its weight, its silence. And then, at exactly 8:07 that evening, as he stood in the garden of the presbytery, the air shifted. The temperature dropped. From somewhere, though he couldn't tell from where, came the faint sound of a train whistle. Impossible. The nearest working line was miles away, and no train was scheduled at that hour. But the sound was real, and with it came the strange certainty that the smiling man had boarded a train after all, a train that had nothing to do with rails or stations. That night, someone knocked at the presbytery door. Father Brown opened it to find no one there, only an envelope on the step. Inside was a single scrap of newspaper cut so precisely that it seemed surgical. It was an obituary, not for the dead man, for someone else entirely, someone who, according to the date printed, would die tomorrow. Mallory didn't believe him when he showed it to him. "Probably a prank," he said, though his eyes kept returning to the paper. But when Father Brown checked the name, the address, the details, he felt a coldness seep into his bones. The person named was still alive that morning. By nightfall they were not, and the death bore the same expression, that same smiling, unreadable amusement. The days that followed brought more signs, more tickets, more silent packages left in impossible places. Each one was linked to someone who would soon be found dead. Each, one holding that same faint mocking smile. Father Brown began to suspect that the killer, or whatever this was not choosing his victims at random. There was a pattern, a purpose, and it was leading, step by step, toward him. By the 5th death, even Mallory had stopped pretending it was coincidence. "Someone's playing with us," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "But why send you the signs? Why not just do it?" Father Brown's reply was quiet. "Because they want me to know. They want me to watch. And when the time comes..." He trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. The final package arrived on a Wednesday. No ticket this time, no watch, just a small mirror, no bigger than a coin. But when Father Brown looked into it, he saw, not his own face, but the smiling man's. And behind that smile, the reflection of a dark, endless tunnel, stretching into nothing. That evening, Mrs. McCarthy noticed that the timetable at the abandoned station had been wiped clean. Every trace of dust was gone. Only one time remained, scrawled in fresh chalk, 8:07, and under it, 2 words. "Next passenger." Father Brown said nothing. He only turned away, his hand tightening around the coin-sized mirror. Later, when Mallory demanded to know what it meant, he gave the faintest of smiles, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know who's behind it," he said at last, his voice low. "But the truth will never be told." Chapter 2. The Secret. Behind Locked Doors. The first sound Father Brown heard was not a cry, not a footstep, not even a whisper. It was the faint, deliberate click of a lock turning from the inside of a door that had never been opened in decades. His heart froze, and for a moment he questioned whether the world had simply slipped sideways, folding into some darker version of itself where the impossible had become routine. The door was in the abandoned wing of the old Kembleford Manor, a place the villagers dared only mention in hushed tones, where rumours of hidden crimes and vanished family members lingered like ghosts. Father Brown had come looking for clues, but the clue had already been waiting for him, and it was alive. The morning had started like any other, drizzling, grey and hesitant, with the mist curling over the churchyard as if concealing secrets. But when Mrs. McCarthy arrived at the presbytery, her knuckles white as she clutched a note, Father Brown knew something had shifted. The note bore a single sentence: "The answers hide behind the doors you cannot enter." No signature, no explanation, only the words and the heavy sense that someone was watching, testing him, leading him into a trap. He arrived at the manor with Mallory reluctantly in tow, the inspector muttering about wasting time on superstition and old stories, though even his voice betrayed unease. The manor had long been empty, its windows darkened with age, its roof sagging in places like the house itself was weary of the world. Father Brown's steps echoed on the marble floors of the grand entrance hall, each echo multiplying into the silence, making the walls themselves seem to lean closer, listening. The locked door was at the end of a long corridor, polished wood, iron fittings corroded with rust, and the faint aroma of decay that only comes from things untouched by life for far too long. He knelt, brushing away centuries of dust, and found a keyhole unlike any other he had seen. Tiny, precise, almost surgical. No ordinary key could fit it. Yet, somewhere deep in the recesses of the manor, he sensed that the key existed, or perhaps had always existed, and that it might be watching him as much as he was watching the door. As Father Brown traced his fingers along the edge of the door, he noticed something peculiar. Scratches, almost like tiny tally marks, running vertically along the frame. They were deliberate, methodical, unnervingly patient. Whoever, or whatever had left, them had been keeping track, counting down, or counting up. The numbers made no sense at first, but slowly he realized they were dates. Or perhaps names encoded as numbers. Each mark represented someone who had entered the manor and had not returned. Mallory frowned. This is nonsense. Old scratches, children's games, nothing more. But Father Brown felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the air thick with anticipation. He put his hand against the wood, and a shiver ran down his spine, not from cold but from recognition. It was a presence, intelligent and dark, like the house itself, exhaling a secret it had been forced to keep. He could almost hear it speaking, if only he could understand the language. He found a small crack along the door, enough to peer through, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The room beyond was empty, yet not empty. Shadows shifted where no light should fall, and in the far corner something sat, or waited. He could not tell what it was, but it felt deliberate, conscious, a sentience folded into darkness. And then, just as he blinked, the shadow smiled. Not humanly, not in any way a living thing should, but the same terrible smile that had haunted the dead man in the station, the same knowing, unreadable expression that promised both revelation and destruction. He stepped back, startled, and the door clicked again. The sound was softer this time, but unmistakable, the lock turning, the mechanism moving without touch. It was as if the door itself had grown sentient and had just accepted him as a participant in something far beyond explanation. Father Brown realized the room was not simply locked. It was alive. It had memory, intent, and patience measured in lifetimes, not minutes. Inside, He noticed a small envelope perched atop a desk, illuminated by a shaft of waning light from a broken window. He reached for it, but as his fingers brushed the paper, a cold wind swept through the corridor, though no door or window had opened. The envelope contained a single photograph, a man, older, stern, dressed in a uniform that belonged to a bygone era. But the most unsettling part was that the man's face had been partially scratched away, leaving an eerie void where his eyes should have been. The scratches formed a pattern, 3 lines intersecting, just like the mark on the railway ticket from the station. Mallory scoffed at the photograph, but Father Brown could not shake the feeling that it was alive with significance. Every instinct in him screamed that the man in the photograph was not just a clue, but a warning. And beneath that, a question that threatened sanity itself. How many had been taken before, and how many more would follow? Father Brown moved further into the room, the floorboards groaning as if in protest. Every step revealed traces of habitation, dust disturbed in unnatural patterns, footprints appearing in improbable places, and a faint scent of perfume that could not belong to anyone alive. On the wall, a painting of the manor's founder stared down at him. Only the eyes had been altered, gouged into a staring, accusing glare. The deeper he looked, the more he realized that the painting was not just defaced. It was alive in its own way, communicating something urgent, something terrifying. Then he heard it. A whisper, faint, like silk dragging across stone. "Do you see?" it said. "Do you understand?" Father Brown froze, heart hammering. The voice was unmistakably human, yet it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, the ceiling, the air itself. He spun, expecting to confront a person, a trickster, a hidden presence, but there was no one. Only the shadows, shifting, watching. And then the first scream pierced the silence. Not from a throat he could identify, not from anywhere that seemed real. The sound echoed, ricocheted, and vanished as suddenly as it had arrived. Father Brown felt the floor under him tremble, the walls breathe. The room was alive, but alive in a way that defied reason, as if it were testing him, probing him, and counting the moments before it revealed its secret. He found a second envelope, tucked into a drawer. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, brittle with age. The first entry was dated 1872, written in an elegant hand. But the words made no sense. Names were repeated, sentences looped back on themselves, and some pages contained nothing but numbers and symbols. Yet the patterns called to him, pulled at him, suggesting that behind the gibberish was a hidden language, a key that could unlock the locked doors, not just of the manor, but of understanding itself. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, he could not tell. Time seemed to bend inside the room, stretching, contracting, folding over itself. Father Brown realized the journal was a map, not of geography, but of fate. Each entry corresponded to someone's life, some tragic ending, some small death unnoticed by the world. And every name was marked, in the same pattern as the tally marks on the door. Someone had catalogued death itself, recording it meticulously, as though it were an art form. He tried to leave the room, to step back into the world he knew, but the door would not yield. It had become a wall of presence, a living barrier. He pressed his ear to it, and for the first time, he heard movement beyond. Not footsteps, not wind, but breathing. Deep, slow, deliberate. And then, almost inaudibly, a voice whispered, "He knows." "Father." Brown staggered back, grasping for the wall to steady himself. "Knows what?" he murmured into the empty corridor. But the house did not answer. It only waited, patient, silent, suffocating. By the time Mallory realized something was wrong, Father Brown had vanished from sight, though the corridor remained empty, the doors locked as before. Only the journal lay on the floor, open to a page filled with symbols and numbers, as if mocking the inspector, daring him to understand the code. The last line on the page chilled the blood in Mallory's veins. The one who enters knows but cannot leave unchanged. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the manor. The villagers whispered that the old house was cursed, that doors moved on their own, that shadows were alive. Father Brown had walked inside willingly, yet somehow everyone feared that he would not emerge as the same man. And perhaps they were right. That night, the presbytery received a single telegram, unsigned, bearing only one cryptic line: "He has seen, and now the house knows him too." Father Brown held the telegram in his hands, the weight of the words pressing into his chest. He looked at Mallory, whose eyes begged for explanation, for reason, for hope. But Father Brown could only shake his head slowly. "I know the truth," he whispered, voice trembling. "But the house, it will not let it be spoken. Some doors once opened cannot be closed, and behind them, the secret waits." The clock struck 8:07, precisely as it had at the station, and Father Brown felt a chill that ran deeper than any winter wind. Somewhere in the manor a door clicked. Someone, or something, was waiting, watching, counting, and the secret behind it was not meant for the living. The next knock at the presbytery door came just after midnight. Father Brown did not move to answer. He only stared at the shadowed corner of the room, where the faint outline of the smiling man seemed to hover, half in reality, half in nightmare. And he understood, with a clarity that made his soul shiver, that the locked doors of the manor were no longer just a mystery. They were a trap, and he was already inside it. Chapter 3. Father Brown faces silent killer. Father Brown realized too late that the silence itself was the murderer, that every still moment had been plotting against him while he thought himself safe, and that the world had folded into a space where breath could kill. The first sign was not a scream, not a shadow, not even a creak of floorboards. It was the absence of sound, a vacuum so complete it made the hairs on his neck stand on end, and the blood in his veins pulse in a way that felt unnatural. He knew instantly that he was not alone, and yet no one moved, no one spoke, and no one could be seen. Only death waited, patient, invisible, and smiling in that way he had come to dread. The day had begun as grey and hesitant as any in Kembleford, the kind of day where fog drifts in from the moors and clings to the stone cottages as if holding their secrets in place. Father Brown had been called to a small dilapidated house on the edge of the village, the kind of place that seemed to have been abandoned by time itself. Mrs. McCarthy, once again the harbinger of dread, had arrived before him, pale and shaking, leaving only a whisper. "They're silent now, Father." And they wait. Her meaning was unclear, but Father Brown felt it instantly, the gravity of something unseen, something intentional. Inside the house the air was thick, unnaturally still. Dust hung in beams of light like floating spectres, and the furniture, though intact, seemed pressed into positions of unnatural attention. Every object felt like a witness, every shadow a sentinel. Father Brown's first step made the floor groan under him, and yet, as he moved further, he noticed that other floors, other rooms, remained disturbingly quiet. No signs of human movement, no footprints in the dust except his own, yet he felt watched, followed, assessed. The first victim, or at least the first clue of the silent killer, appeared in the parlour. A chair lay toppled on its side, yet no one had moved it. On the floor, a faint outline in dust traced the shape of a body, but when Father Brown looked closer, there was no body at all. Just an impression, like a shadow pressed into reality. It was a terrifying reminder that absence could speak louder than presence, and that the killer had already acted in ways that defied logic, leaving no trace other than suggestion. As he advanced, He found the small writing desk against the wall. The drawer, slightly ajar, revealed a single piece of paper, folded with care. On it were words, carefully printed in a hand that was disturbingly familiar. I am here, though you do not see me. I have always been here, and I will always be. Father Brown's chest tightened. This was no ordinary murderer. This was someone, or something that toyed with perception itself, that made absence a weapon and whose intelligence was nearly untraceable. Then he heard it, the faintest whisper, a breath of sound that barely disturbed the air. "Do you understand?" the voice asked, somewhere between a hiss and a sigh. Father Brown froze. It was not coming from the corner nor from the ceiling. It was everywhere and nowhere. He looked at the shadows stretching across the walls, twisting unnaturally, moving as if alive. The silence around him now carried a weight, an awareness, and a malevolence that could not be ignored. He turned a corner into the hallway, and that's when the first movement betrayed the silent killer. A door at the end of the corridor. Locked, yet always ajar, shifted by the slightest fraction, as if someone's hand had passed through the air without leaving a trace. He approached it slowly, sensing that the room beyond held the key to understanding, though he could not yet see how. The lock clicked softly, though he did not touch it. The house itself seemed to grant access, but only on its own terms, in its own time. Inside the room, the evidence of the silent killer became grotesquely tangible. A series of photographs lay scattered across the floor faces of villagers he recognized but twisted subtly, their expressions altered to show horror and awe at the same time. Each photograph had been marked with a single tally line in red ink, blood red, almost too fresh to be true. Father Brown's mind reeled. These were victims, or warnings, or both, and the tally marks suggested that each encounter had been meticulously counted, orchestrated. He noticed one photograph in particular, pinned to the wall above the fireplace. It was of himself, standing in the presbytery only hours before. The eyes in the photo, though captured in stillness, seemed to glimmer with awareness, as if the camera had trapped something alive. Underneath, a small note read, "You see, but do you know? You hear, but do you understand?" Father Brown's stomach churned. The killer was here, but had been invisible, intangible, leaving traces that could only be perceived by intuition, by fear, by the mind's deepest shadows. As he traced the sequence of photographs, along the walls he realized the killer had orchestrated a chronological map of deaths. Each image corresponded to a time, a place, a circumstance that had led to sudden, inexplicable deaths across Kembleford. And all of them, he noticed with horror, were linked to the number 807. The same hour as the station, the manor, the presbytery clock. The pattern was now undeniable. The silent killer had a schedule, and the schedule had been designed with terrifying precision. Mallory arrived shouting as he entered the house, but even his voice seemed swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "Father, what is this?" His eyes darted from photograph to photograph, but even he could not see the killer. Only Father Brown, alone, understood that silence itself was a weapon. And then, in the mirror across the room, Father Brown caught the first direct sign. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, reflected back at him. Its face was obscured, but its smile was unmistakable. The same, unreadable, horrifying smile that had haunted the station and the manor. Yet when he turned, the room was empty. The tension escalated as he explored further. Every room in the house seemed to warp reality. Floors that should creak remained still, doors that should resist opened of their own accord, and shadows twisted in ways that defied geometry. He stumbled upon a hidden staircase leading to a basement, that had never been entered. Or at least that was what he thought. The air was colder here, saturated with damp, and something else, something metallic. And as he descended, the whisper returned, louder this time. Closer. Always closer. In the basement, he found rows of cabinets, each filled with objects that defied rational explanation. Watches stopped at 8:07, notebooks filled with endless tally marks, photographs of people who were still alive, yet marked with the same red ink. Each item seemed to pulse with intention, as though the silent killer had imbued the objects themselves with a will, a consciousness that tracked, observed, and waited. And then he saw it, a small box, unassuming, locked with a mechanism that seemed impossible to pick. Yet, when he touched it, it clicked open, as if welcoming him. Inside lay a series of letters, addressed to him in handwriting he did not recognize, though each one contained intimate knowledge of his thoughts, his doubts, his fears. The first letter read, "You think yourself safe, but safety is a lie. You hear, but do you listen? You see, but do you understand?" Father Brown felt a chill that reached deep into his soul. The silent killer had anticipated him, studied him, and had left a trail designed not to lead him to safety, but to madness. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, he could no longer tell. The house seemed to bend time, to stretch reality, to make every heartbeat a countdown. And then he realized the most terrifying truth. The killer was not outside the house. The killer was not a person in the ordinary sense. It was the pattern itself, the silence itself, the space between the ticks of the clock, the pause between thoughts, the waiting. And it had chosen him precisely to be the next victim in a sequence that no one could trace, no one could interrupt, and no one could survive. Mallory tried to intervene, but even he could not act against something so abstract, so deliberate, so invisible. Father Brown felt the walls close in, the air thicken, the shadows stretch into sentient forms. The photographs on the walls seemed to lean toward him, their eyes glimmering, their red tally marks bleeding just a fraction, as if alive. And then the whisper came one final time, close enough for him to feel the breath. He knows you, and now you know him. But can you survive what you understand? Father Brown stepped back, his hand clutching the letters, his mind spinning. Every instinct screamed escape, yet the house, the silence, the killer itself seemed to anticipate his move, countering before he could act. The line between life and death, between reality and illusion, had collapsed. And he understood, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that the silent killer had never existed in the way he imagined. It had always been part of him, and now he was part of it, inseparable from a sequence of events that had been orchestrated far beyond mortal comprehension. By the time he emerged, or at least he believed he emerged, the first light of dawn had touched Kembleford. But nothing was the same. The village itself seemed altered, shadows lingering in corners that should have been bright, and somewhere, far away, the echo of a clock striking 8:07 reminded him that the silent killer's work was ongoing, patient, unrelenting. When Mallory asked him what had happened, Father Brown only shook his head slowly. "I know who did it," he said quietly, voice strained, eyes hollow with the knowledge of what he had faced. "But the truth will never be told, and the next time, it will find another listener." Outside, the wind carried a faint whisper, almost drowned in the rustle of leaves. Closer, always closer. He waits in silence, and silence waits in him. Chapter 4. A Murder Without Any Weapon. The moment Father Brown stepped into the dimly lit drawing room, he knew he was facing a murder that had no shape, no edge, and no hand to hold it. A death that existed only in the spaces between reason and fear. leaving its victim lying still as if the world itself had struck. The body was there, unmistakable, yet there was no weapon, no sign of struggle, nothing that could explain how life had been snuffed out so utterly and silently. Even the air in the room seemed complicit, heavy and unnatural, pressing down on him as though it had been waiting for this revelation. It had started with a message delivered by the trembling hand of Mrs. McCarthy. The words were brief, almost cryptic. "Father, there is no weapon, and yet there is blood. Please hurry." The urgency in her voice carried the weight of someone who had glimpsed something unnatural, and Father Brown had not hesitated. He left the presbytery without even changing his coat, feeling the first twinges of the dread that had become familiar after the events at the station and the manor. The house was quiet, more quiet than a human dwelling should ever be. The floorboards creaked only where he stepped. Otherwise there was no sound, no wind, no distant footsteps, no animal stirring. And in the middle of the grand room lay the victim, Mr. Langley, a man known for his meticulous habits, now sprawled unnaturally, his eyes wide and frozen, a faint sheen of crimson staining the cuffs of his shirt. Yet, as Father Brown approached, he saw nothing that could have caused this. No knife, no blunt instrument, no chemical vial, no rope, no hidden contraption. The room itself seemed unscathed. Inspector Mallory arrived moments later, his face pale but insisting on an air of control. "This is impossible," he muttered. "No signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing. How?" He trailed off, unable to finish the question. Father Brown only shook his head, crouching beside the body. He noticed the faintest indentation along the victim's throat, not deep enough to be a wound, barely perceptible, yet there, a mark of pressure, of unseen force. It was subtle, almost ceremonial, as if death had been administered with invisible hands. Father Brown rose slowly, his eyes scanning the room. The furniture, the books, the chandelier overhead, nothing was out of place. It was as if life had been extracted in a moment so precise that the universe itself had conspired to hide the means. A faint smell lingered, metallic and cold, but not blood. A sense of disturbance hovered, like a shadow cast by something that did not exist in this world. "Mallory," Father Brown said quietly. "Someone, or something, killed him without touching him, without leaving a mark that we understand." The inspector frowned. "You mean a ghost?" His voice was incredulous, though even he could not disguise the tremor. Father Brown did not answer immediately. He moved to the mantelpiece and noticed a thin, folded sheet of paper tucked behind a clock. The paper bore a single line written in tight, deliberate script. "The hand that strikes is unseen, but the knowledge is precise." The message made the hair on Father Brown's neck stand. Whoever or whatever had done this was calculating, meticulous, and cruelly theatrical. Hours passed as he examined the room, mapping out angles, patterns, and possibilities that should have existed but didn't. Each glance revealed new anomalies. Faint smudges of dust, on the carpet in patterns that resembled footprints, but none of the shapes matched human feet. The curtains fluttered lightly, though no window was open. A clock ticked irregularly, pausing mid-second, as if time itself hesitated. Father Brown felt the oppressive certainty that the murder was not merely of flesh, but of order, of logic, of understanding itself. He opened a drawer in the desk and found letters, old correspondences that had been hidden meticulously. One letter referenced Mr. Langley's past visits to the abandoned manor. Another hinted at a secret held in the presbytery itself, a record of names and times, all of them eerily connected to previous deaths in the village. It was as though the silent, invisible force that had claimed Langley was following a script, one written in human ink, yet enacted by an entity beyond comprehension. Mallory's patience broke as the night deepened. "This is madness, Father. A man is dead. We need something tangible. A killer. A weapon. A clue we can grasp. This." He gestured at the room, at the impossibility of it all. "This is beyond sense." But Father Brown remained calm, though inwardly the weight of the impossibility pressed on him. He had learned to see beyond the ordinary, to read the shadows and the gaps between moments, but even he found this murder unnervingly precise. He moved to the corner where the light of a single lamp fell. There on the floor, faint marks formed a shape, something like a handprint, but incomplete, hollowed, as if only the essence of touch had impressed itself upon the world. He knelt, tracing the outline with his fingers, and realized the terrifying implication. The killer had no need for physical presence. It could strike through thought, through fear, through anticipation, leaving the body lifeless while leaving the mind intact, or at least aware enough to feel the extraction of life. Father Brown's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Could it be a chemical agent, engineered to act instantaneously? Unlikely. No residue, no scent, nothing that could be analysed. Could it be some unknown device? The room was scrutinised, measured, and scanned. Nothing was found. And yet the death had occurred, undeniably. The first big reveal came in the form of a notebook he discovered beneath a loose floorboard. The entries, written over decades, documented similar deaths in the village, always noting the absence of weapon, the precision of timing, the eerie recurrence of 8:07. Each record was accompanied by a cryptic symbol, a triangle, a circle, and a cross intersecting. A mark Father Brown had now seen multiple times, linking the station, the manor, and the house itself. It became clear that this was not mere coincidence. A pattern had been designed, and the force behind it was orchestrating death like a conductor with a symphony, each movement invisible yet exact, each note struck without a tangible instrument. Even Mallory could no longer deny the scope. "It's as if someone has perfected murder as an abstract concept," he muttered, staring at the notebook. Father Brown nodded, though the realization weighed heavily on him. This was more than a crime. It was a psychological dominion, an assault on reality itself. The killer was teaching a lesson not just in fear, but in the limits of understanding, forcing all who observed into a state of helpless awe. The night deepened, shadows lengthened, and Father Brown felt a presence in the room that was not human. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, a coldness that moved with intention, a stillness that carried weight, a sense of being watched and evaluated. The silent killer was near, close enough that he could feel its intent pressing on his thoughts, yet invisible to the eyes, untouchable by hands. And then came the whisper, soft and deliberate. "Knowledge is the weapon, and the hand is everywhere." Father Brown's blood ran cold. The voice was not audible to Mallory, who now stood, trembling at the doorway. Yet it resonated in Father Brown's mind with a precision that made his heart pound. The killer did not strike with steel, nor with fire, nor with poison. It struck with intellect, with foreknowledge, with an understanding of human frailty so profound, it became lethal. Father Brown retraced the room once more, searching for anything that could anchor him, any clue that might turn the abstract into tangible evidence. But the room refused to yield. Every inch was scrutinized and found wanting. The murder had left no weapon because the instrument had been thought itself, applied with perfect accuracy at the exact moment. Langley had died not by hands or objects, but by the unseen calculus of the killer's mind, a weapon of intellect and anticipation beyond human comprehension. By the early hours of dawn, Father Brown had compiled the details he could grasp, aware that they formed only a partial understanding. Each fact pointed to the presence of the same, invisible killer, the same pattern threading through every death, every cryptic mark, every 807 timestamp, and every unnerving smile he had encountered in shadowed faces and photographs. Yet, even as he documented, the realization pressed on him. There would be no solution that satisfied reason alone. The murder without any weapon was a statement, a lesson, and a warning, one that could reach him as easily as it had reached Langley. When Mallory asked him what it meant, Father Brown's eyes were hollow with the burden of truth. "I know who did it," he said quietly, voice strained, almost breaking. "But the truth will never be told. Not fully. Not while the instrument remains unseen and the mind that wields it, unbound." Outside, the first light of morning crept over Kembleford, yet the shadows of the night lingered unnaturally long. Somewhere in the village, a clock struck 8:07, and Father Brown felt the echo in his chest, a reminder that the silent, invisible hand had moved once more, and that the lesson of the murder without any weapon was far from complete. The wind carried a faint whisper through the trees, a voice not heard but understood. Every thought is a strike, every hesitation a wound, and every witness a potential victim. Chapter 5. Father Brown breaks impossible alibi. The moment Father Brown realized the alibi was perfect, airtight, and yet utterly false, the world seemed to tilt beneath him, and he understood that reality itself had been manipulated to conceal a truth so horrifying it threatened to shatter every assumption he had ever held. The man who could not have been anywhere near the scene of the crime, who had witnesses, tickets, receipts, and timesheets proving his innocence, was in some terrifyingly precise way the killer. The impossibility pressed down on Father Brown like a physical weight, and he could feel the walls of logic bending and cracking around him. It began with the call from Inspector Mallory, urgent, clipped, his voice betraying more confusion than usual. "Father, you need to come to the station. There's something about this case. Something that defies explanation. The alibi, it shouldn't exist, yet it does." Father Brown felt that familiar knot of foreboding in his stomach, the one that had followed him from the manor, the silent killer, the murder without any weapon. He left the presbytery immediately, stepping into the grey dawn with a sense that the world itself had turned against reason. At the station, the man in question, Mr. Hargrove, stood nervously, hands clasped, eyes darting as though they could see Father Brown's thoughts. He was calm, composed, almost too calm. Every piece of evidence pointed away from him. Train tickets with timestamps, letters from colleagues confirming meetings, receipts from the local inn. Yet something about him made Father Brown uneasy. A subtle tension in his posture, a hesitation in his eyes that suggested knowledge far beyond the ordinary. Father Brown examined each alibi in turn, meticulously. Every witness corroborated every detail, every time-stamped document, every ledger entry, every public appearance all aligned perfectly. Yet the room itself, quiet, enclosed, seemingly ordinary, vibrated with the sense of impossibility. Something was wrong. Something was being hidden. But it was hidden in plain sight, crafted so flawlessly that no ordinary investigation could uncover it. He asked Mr. Hargrove to recount his movements, paying close attention to his tone, the smallest inflections, the subtle shifts of expression that might betray the truth. Every word was precise, rehearsed, yet underneath the surface, Father Brown perceived a rhythm, a cadence that suggested more than the words themselves. The alibi was a story told to deceive, but it was not just a lie. It was a lie crafted with the precision of a master, a narrative engineered to withstand scrutiny, to be immune to doubt. As he walked through the timeline, Father Brown noticed something that made his heart pound. A discrepancy, almost invisible. A single moment where Mr. Hargrove's presence was unverified, a gap so fleeting that it seemed to exist only in the shadows of memory. A clerk at the station had glanced away, a servant had stepped outside, and in that moment, a moment lasting no more than 30 seconds, the impossible had occurred. That was all the time the killer needed. And it was enough. Father Brown traced the logic further. How could someone commit murder, vanish, and return, leaving no trace and all within a perfect alibi? The answer, he realized, lay not in the physical world, but in the manipulation of perception itself. Witnesses had been guided, times engineered, appearances choreographed. With invisible hands, it was as if the killer had bent reality around themselves, folding time and space in a way that ordinary minds could not perceive. The implications were staggering. The crime had been committed not just with intent, but with omniscience. He returned to the scene of the murder, retracing the steps, the angles, the opportunities. Everything aligned with the alibi, and yet he could feel the presence of deception, lurking, deliberate, patient. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with anticipation. There were subtle clues, slight disturbances in dust on the floor, a faint scuff mark on the carpet, the tilt of a picture frame that suggested someone had moved through the space, unseen, unnoticed. The killer had performed a perfect heist of life itself, leaving evidence meticulously curated to protect their narrative. Father Brown's mind raced. He began reconstructing the crime in his head, second by second. Each movement, each breath, each glance accounted for. And then it became clear. The impossible alibi was not impossible because it was flawless, but because the killer had prepared for scrutiny in a way that anticipated investigation. They had known every question, every doubt, every step an investigator might take, and had built a framework that turned inquiry into deception. It was not just a crime. It was a trap for reason itself. Mallory grew frustrated as Father Brown outlined the scenario. "You're saying he could be both here and there at the same time?" he asked, incredulous. Father Brown nodded slowly. "Yes. And more than that, he has structured the world so that it will deny the truth to anyone who seeks it. The alibi is not a lie. It is a reality shaped to deceive." The inspector's hands shook slightly. He had seen strange cases before, but nothing that undermined the very fabric of certainty. This was beyond ordinary comprehension. Father Brown turned his attention back to Mr. Hargrove, observing him closely. The man's composure had begun to crack, subtle lines forming at the corners of his eyes, a slight tremor in his hands. The first big reveal came as Father Brown realized that the killer had left a trace not in the physical world, but in thought, an imperceptible manipulation of others' perception, a control over attention and memory, so subtle that it functioned as a weapon more powerful than any blade or gun. The alibi had been constructed through the orchestration of minds, not matter. He examined the documents, again, noticing patterns he had not seen before. Slight inconsistencies in ink, variations in handwriting, subtle pauses in the accounts that suggested coaching or alteration. The killer had accounted for these as well, embedding the hints so subtly that only a mind trained to perceive nuance, to read the spaces between words, could detect them. Father Brown felt a chill. The crime was perfect, yet it was not flawless. It required someone willing to see beyond the obvious, someone who could interpret shadows and silence. Hours passed in tense examination. Father Brown reconstructed every step, every interaction, every movement, until the timeline, impossible though it seemed, began to crack under the weight of human perception. The alibi, while outwardly perfect, had gaps invisible to most eyes, but visible to his. In those fractions of a moment, the killer had acted. The impossible had been executed, and the truth was hidden within the spaces that normal investigation overlooked. As he pondered the implications, Father Brown noticed a small object tucked behind a ledger. A delicate watch, stopped at precisely 8:07. The same hour he had seen repeated in previous cases, the same hour tied to other murders and impossible events. The watch was more than a clue. It was a signature, a reminder that the killer was orchestrating a pattern that spanned time, memory, and space. Each event was a note in a symphony of terror, and the alibi was merely a movement within it, designed to lull observers into complacency. Mallory, growing increasingly anxious, asked if there was any way to prove the manipulation. Father Brown shook his head. "Proof will elude you, Inspector. It is in the perception, not the object. The alibi is a fortress of the mind, not of matter. Yet I know the truth. I have traced the invisible threads, followed the subtle manipulations, and I have seen where the impossible bends." The tension mounted as Father Brown outlined the sequence. The killer had exploited attention, expectation, and trust, arranging witnesses and documents so meticulously that their movements were undetectable. Every observer, every clerk, every servant had unknowingly played a part in reinforcing the alibi. The murderer was not merely skilled. They were an architect of reality, bending logic itself to conceal the act. Then, in the silence that followed, a whisper seemed to brush against Father Brown's ear, though no one else heard it. "You see it now? But can you stop it?" The words were not audible, yet they resonated with terrifying clarity in his mind. The impossible alibi was not just a shield, it was a challenge, a puzzle designed to test intellect, patience, and courage. And as Father Brown realized this, he understood the chilling truth. The killer had not finished. The pattern continued, and he was now drawn deeper into the web, closer to the center of a darkness that defied comprehension. Father Brown studied Mr. Hargrove one last time. The man's eyes betrayed nothing, yet Father Brown could feel the invisible weight of calculation pressing outward, a presence both inside and outside the room, shaping thought, perception, and belief. "I know who did it," he whispered finally, voice trembling with the burden of understanding. But the truth will never be told, not while the world believes in impossibility, and not while the alibi shields the guilty. Outside, the first light of dawn struggled through the fog over Kembleford, but even as the village stirred to life, Father Brown felt the lingering tension of the invisible hand, guiding, shaping, and waiting. Somewhere, far away, a clock struck 8:07, and he knew with an unsettling certainty that the impossible alibi was only one piece of a design far greater than he could yet comprehend. And as the wind whispered through the trees, the same silent, calculated presence seemed to laugh, unseen, leaving Father Brown with the haunting question, how do you prove the impossible when the impossible itself is alive? Chapter 6. The Corpse That Vanished. Overnight. Father Brown awoke to a scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night, only to discover that the body it had belonged to had disappeared, leaving the bed and the room stubbornly intact, as if death itself had been reversed by some unseen hand. The horror of that moment was not simply the absence of the corpse, but the certainty that the universe had allowed a reality so impossible that it defied all reason and memory. How could body vanish? How could a life be erased without a trace, leaving only the chilling residue of fear and confusion? Father Brown felt the air tighten around him, pressing against his lungs with the weight of unsolved terror. It began with a message from Constable Reed, trembling in the doorway of the presbytery. "Father, it's gone. The body. It was right there last night. And now it's gone." Father Brown's mind raced. The previous cases, the silent killer, the murder without any weapon, the impossible alibi, all led here. But this was beyond comprehension. This was not just a crime. It was an assault on reality itself. Every instinct screamed that he must investigate, yet every logical explanation dissolved into a fog of impossibility. Arriving at the scene, Father Brown felt the strange quiet that always heralded the most unnerving of mysteries. The chamber where Mr. Langley's corpse had lain the night before was now undisturbed. The bed was made neatly, the blanket tucked, precisely as if nothing had occurred, the sheets without a single disturbance. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of removal, no fingerprints, no blood, no shadow of a struggle. The room seemed to mock the very notion of death, presenting a tableau of normalcy where horror had previously reigned. Father Brown crouched, examining every inch of the floor, the corners, the furniture. A faint trace of dust seemed disturbed near the fireplace, but no patterns suggested human movement. The window, locked and bolted, was pristine. The door, untouched from the inside, remained as secure as it had been. Every element reinforced the impossibility. This was not a disappearance. It was an erasure, a vanishing performed with such precision that it left the world ignorant of the very existence it had just witnessed. The constable's unease grew. No one could have moved him. Not with the guards and locks and all. Father Brown nodded silently, aware that articulating the magnitude of this event would only sound like madness. Yet instinctively he understood that this vanishing was not random. It was deliberate, purposeful, executed by someone or something with an extraordinary command over the unseen. The previous murders had been clever. This was artistry, cruel and absolute. Father Brown examined the wardrobe and drawers, knowing that killers sometimes hid bodies in plain sight, in ways that defied immediate recognition. Nothing. Even the floorboards were inspected, yet the planks were secure, uncut, unbroken. Father Brown's mind mapped every possible method, yet each path ended in impossibility. He felt the pull of the invisible pattern, the same thread that connected every death, every manipulation, every impossibly orchestrated event in Kembleford. Someone was proving that life and death were mere components in a game they controlled entirely. Returning to the previous records, Father Brown noticed subtle repetitions, times, symbols, and references that tied. This vanishing to past occurrences. The same 807 signature, the same cryptic notations, the same manipulation of alibis and perception. The killer, or orchestrator, was not just striking. They were composing a symphony of terror, each note impossible, each movement beyond the understanding of ordinary minds. And this vanishing, more than any prior act, confirmed the depth of the mastermind's reach. Father Brown revisited the bed, running his fingers across the sheets. Faint impressions lingered, almost imperceptible, like the memory of a body pressed into the linen. But they faded when examined too closely. It was as though reality itself resisted scrutiny, hiding the truth in subtleties so profound that most observers would never perceive it. And yet, Father Brown felt it. A psychic vibration, a residue of life extracted, leaving nothing behind but the echo of absence. Hours passed as Father Brown interviewed the household. Servants swore they had seen the corpse the night before. Neighbours confirmed noises and commotion, yet no one could explain its disappearance. Even the guards, meticulous in their routines, could offer no rational account. Every account confirmed the initial presence, and every account could not reconcile with the current emptiness. Father Brown's eyes narrowed as he listened. The psychological depth of the act was staggering. Whoever had done this understood not just death, but the fragility of perception itself. He explored the possibility of sleight of hand, of trickery, of secret passages or hidden compartments, but each idea collided with reality. Nothing could account for a body removed entirely, without trace, in a room under constant watch and physical impossibility. Yet the vanishing had occurred, undeniable, leaving Father Brown grappling with the idea that the laws of matter and space had been violated, or at least had been manipulated to appear so. Returning to the bedside table, he discovered a note that had not been there previously. What is seen is not. What is not seen is everything. The writing was delicate, precise, almost ritualistic. Father Brown felt a shiver. The note was not a threat. It was an explanation, a taunt, and a revelation all at once. The killer, or orchestrator, was not working within the limitations of weapons or alibis, but within the limitations of comprehension. This was no ordinary crime. This was a challenge, a psychological assault designed to shatter certainty. Father Brown felt some psychological pressure tighten. The vanishing corpse was not just a puzzle, it was a statement. Every detective, every witness, every observer was being forced to confront the unreliability of perception. How could one trust their senses, their memory, or their understanding when death itself could disappear without trace? And yet, he could not abandon the pursuit. To understand was to survive. To ignore was to invite further manipulation. The inspector arrived again, visibly shaken. "Father, it's as if the corpse never existed." His voice trembled. Father Brown nodded, aware that words could not convey the depth of what had occurred. "It existed, Mallory," he said softly, "and yet it does not. That is the point. The vanishing is proof that the killer controls not just action, but awareness. We are now participants, unwilling and unaware, in a reality they sculpt at will." As night fell over Kembleford, Father Brown revisited every detail. The bed, the floor, the notes, the faint impressions, all indicated a pattern, a manipulation of existence itself. He recalled past cases, the murder without weapon, the impossible alibi, the silent killer, all threads converging here, culminating in an act that challenged the very concept of life and death. The vanishing corpse was more than murder. It was a psychological dominion, a display of control over matter, mind, and perception. In the darkness, Father Brown felt a presence, subtle, unseen, observing. It was not human. It did not breathe or move. Yet it was aware, deliberate, calculating. The same invisible hand that had orchestrated previous impossibilities had now extended to erasure itself, demonstrating mastery over events, over understanding, over certainty. It was a force that could strike without leaving trace, a consciousness that could bend perception as effortlessly as one might fold a page. He approached the wardrobe one last time, intuition pulling him toward the unseen. Every instinct screamed that the truth lay not in physical evidence but in the patterns of human thought, in the manipulation of expectation, in the faint residue left in consciousness itself. And then, in a moment of clarity that sent chills down his spine, he realized the corpse had not vanished. It had been removed in a manner beyond detection. Yet the real power lay in making the witnesses, the investigators, and the world believe that it had disappeared by impossibility alone. Father Brown returned to the note. What is not seen is everything. It was now undeniable. The killer was not concerned merely with death, but with perception. Each previous crime, each impossible alibi, each silent act had been a rehearsal, a step toward demonstrating total dominion over human understanding. The vanishing corpse was not the end, but a midpoint, a demonstration of capability so extreme that the observer could no longer trust the world itself. As he left the house, Father Brown's thoughts churned. The pattern extended, connecting the vanished corpse to past murders, impossible alibis, and silent killers. Somewhere, beyond his sight, a force orchestrated events with invisible precision, aware of every thought, every expectation, every hesitation. The village slept, oblivious, while a genius, or madness, unfolded in the shadows. He paused at the gate, staring back at the empty window where the corpse had lain. "I know who did it," he murmured, voice heavy with the weight of impossible knowledge. "But the truth will never be told, not while they remain unseen, and not while perception is their weapon." The wind stirred through the trees, carrying a whisper that made him shiver. The unseen is everywhere, and the observed is never certain. And in that moment, Father Brown understood the terror of the night. The corpse had vanished, yet the presence remained, alive in minds, in fears, in the fragile certainty that the world could no longer be trusted. A question lingered, unsolvable, unending. If death could vanish without trace, if reality itself could be manipulated so completely, then what else had been taken? And what would be taken next? Chapter 7. Father Brown Hunts. The invisible Father Brown realized, in a moment that twisted his very soul, that he was no longer chasing a man, a clue, or even a murderer, but something that could not be seen, touched, or pinned down, and yet its presence was more tangible than life itself. The invisible stalked him, weaving through rooms, shadows, and thoughts, manipulating the world as easily as breathing, and every step he took brought him closer to madness. The streets of Kembleford, the silent corridors of manor houses, the fog-laden paths of the village, all seemed to shimmer with an unseen hand, guiding events, altering perception, erasing evidence, and mocking his every attempt to confront reality. It began with the disappearance of Mr. Langley's corpse, the vanishing that had haunted him through sleepless nights. But now the invisible extended further, reaching into people's minds, twisting memory and certainty. Father Brown understood that the game had changed. The killer, or orchestrator, was no longer bound by physical laws. They moved in spaces where no one could follow, shaping events with imperceptible precision, leaving behind only the residue of impossibility. He started by revisiting the crime scenes, one by one, retracing steps he had thought mapped and understood. The manor, with its locked rooms and hidden passageways, was now a labyrinth of illusion. Every doorway, every corridor seemed to warp subtly under his gaze. Shadows shifted unnaturally. Reflections betrayed angles that did not exist. Father Brown felt the pressure of being watched, of being anticipated, but there was no one to confront, only the presence of absence, a calculated void. He interviewed witnesses again, carefully, listening not only to their words, but to what was left unspoken. Each recollection was a puzzle piece deliberately altered, a memory shaped to mislead. He asked about the night the corpse vanished, about strange noises, glimpses of movement, anything that could hint at intervention. Yet answers were inconsistent, contradictory, yet too precise to be accidental. It was as if the invisible orchestrator had rewritten not only events but perception itself, ensuring that everyone, including Father Brown, was complicit in a controlled hallucination. Father Brown explored the psychological implications. If the killer could manipulate perception, then the crime had already been committed in the minds of the observers, before any physical act had occurred. The invisible was not simply unseen, it was unfathomable, manipulating expectation, memory, and attention. Every step he took, every thought he followed, seemed anticipated. The invisible knew him, understood him, predicted him. The boundaries between hunter and hunted blurred until he could no longer trust his own senses. He returned to the presbytery to analyze patterns. Notes, receipts, accounts of movements, all seemed ordinary, yet each contained a subtle distortion. Slight mismatches in time, faint irregularities in language, imperceptible shifts in positioning of objects. These were breadcrumbs deliberately placed for those perceptive enough to follow. Father Brown felt the exhilaration and horror of realization. The invisible killer was leaving clues not to be found, but to be deciphered by a mind attuned to nuance, patience, and extreme attention. Then came the first big reveal. Father Brown noticed a pattern in the disturbances. The invisible's interference always coincided with a moment of doubt, a hesitation, a lapse in perception. The manipulations were not random. They were psychological, targeting human frailty, exploiting the mind's tendency to trust the obvious. He realized with dread that the invisible had been shaping events, not merely to commit murder, but to orchestrate a scenario in which the witnesses, the authorities, and even the priest himself would doubt reality. The killer had weaponized perception itself. He returned to the manor that had hosted the last impossible alibi. The air was thick, almost tactile, with anticipation. Every step he took seemed to echo with presence, yet no one was there. A chair tilted slightly as he passed. A door creaked, though it was locked. A fleeting shadow flickered across the walls. He whispered to himself, trying to anchor his mind. It cannot exist here, yet it does. He traced the signs, subtle as they were, dust disturbed in geometric precision, faint impressions on carpets, slight shifts in objects that revealed the path of the unseen. The invisible's reach was more sinister than Father Brown had feared. It was not only erasing evidence, but actively sowing confusion, chaos, and fear. Witnesses' memories contradicted one another, timelines conflicted without reason, and physical evidence seemed to dissolve when examined. Father Brown realized that he was no longer investigating a crime, but confronting an intelligence that was fundamentally inhuman. One that could manipulate mind and matter, alike, erasing certainty, creating doubt, and leaving terror as the only truth. Hours stretched into a long, suffocating night. Father Brown followed the trails, the whispers of presence, the imperceptible signs that others would dismiss. Each discovery deepened the mystery, leaving him unable to trust what he saw or heard. A faint scratch on a table, the tilt of a vase, a shadow in a mirror. Each seemed trivial, yet together they formed a pattern, a code left by the invisible to be read only by the patient and the vigilant. The invisible had become both a master of murder and a maestro of misdirection, orchestrating events on a scale that mocked all logic. Father Brown's thoughts turned to the psychological depth of the unseen. Whoever, or whatever he hunted, had an almost supernatural understanding of human expectation and error. The killer anticipated reactions, planted false impressions, and manipulated attention so precisely that anyone who observed would unknowingly participate in their deception. It was no longer a matter of finding a weapon, a motive, or a witness. The invisible operated in the liminal space between reality and perception, a predator hunting through thought itself. In the dead of night, he made a chilling realization. The invisible had not only removed the corpse and manipulated alibis, but had also infiltrated his own mind. He questioned every recollection, every memory, every observation, doubting his own senses. Could he trust that he had not been lured into a trap? That the patterns he followed were genuine and not orchestrated illusions? The terror was suffocating, but Father Brown's resolve remained. He must track this intelligence, no matter how intangible, no matter how impossible it seemed. Then he discovered the second clue. A faint line of disrupted dust along the corridor, so subtle it might be mistaken for ordinary settlement, yet too precise, too deliberate to ignore. Following it, he found small impressions in the carpet, slight indentations that revealed a path. Father Brown realized the invisible left trails not to be obvious, but to be interpreted. A subtle dialogue between the orchestrator and the observant. He followed the path with meticulous care, noting every irregularity, every minute detail, aware that one misstep could dissolve the thread entirely. The first encounter with the invisible occurred not in sight, but in perception. Father Brown felt a shift in the air, a pressure on his thoughts, as if someone, or something, was aligning events around him, predicting his reactions. A whisper echoed in his mind, faint and elusive. You chase what cannot be caught, yet it shapes your every step. The words were not spoken aloud, yet they reverberated, impossible to ignore. He realized that this was a psychological predator, a being whose weapon was anticipation and whose shield was intangibility. Father Brown understood that capturing the invisible required more than observation. He had to anticipate the patterns, interpret the signs, and embrace the ambiguity. Each moment, each action, each glance might conceal the next step of the orchestrator. The hunt was now a mental duel, a contest of wits in a dimension where ordinary evidence was irrelevant, and perception itself was the arena. He meticulously mapped every clue, every imperfection, and every subtle shift, building a mental framework capable of containing the unseen. Hours passed, the night stretching interminably. Father Brown pieced together the invisible's previous acts, the vanished corpse, the impossible alibi, the silent manipulations, and saw a web forming. It was a network of deception so elaborate that it would crumble ordinary investigation. And yet, within this chaos, he detected the first coherent pattern, a psychological signature, a method that revealed not the presence of a weapon or hand, but a mind of extraordinary cunning, ruthlessly exploiting every vulnerability in human perception. Then came the first big reveal. The invisible's actions were not arbitrary. Each vanishing, each manipulated alibi, each unseen interference was part of a deliberate escalating demonstration of control. The orchestrator wanted the observers, witnesses, detectives, even Father Brown himself, to confront the limits of understanding, to recognize the fragility of certainty. This was no mere criminal. It was a being seeking dominion over thought itself, teaching terror by bending reality to its will. Father Brown felt the weight of realization, the chilling truth that the hunt for the invisible was not merely about justice, it was about survival of mind and reason. The unseen predator was always one step ahead, manipulating, guiding, testing. Every move he made was anticipated, every question foreseen, every doubt exploited. He understood that to confront the invisible, he must abandon ordinary logic, embrace intuition, and follow the imperceptible threads that connected past, present, and the unseen. In the final moments before dawn, Father Brown paused in the manor's great hall. Shadows flickered unnaturally, the air hummed with expectation, and he felt the gaze of the invisible as if it occupied the very space around him. He whispered, almost to himself, "I know who you are, but can I stop you?" The silence was answered only by the faintest disturbance. A door creaked where no door should move, a shadow shifted against the light, and the invisible reminded him that the hunt was far from over. Father Brown left the manor with a resolve tempered by dread. He understood that the invisible would strike again, that perception itself was the battlefield, and that each clue, each vanishing, each manipulation was a message he had only begun to decipher. The world around him seemed altered, every shadow suspect, every silence meaningful. He knew the invisible had revealed a part of itself, and yet the full truth remained tantalizingly beyond reach, a constant haunting challenge to his mind and spirit. "I know who did it," he murmured into the fog-laden dawn. But the truth will never be told. Not while the invisible moves among us, shaping what is seen, what is remembered, and what is believed. And as he disappeared into the misty streets of Kembleford, the invisible seemed to watch, patient, imperceptible, and utterly in control, leaving Father Brown with the unbearable question: if what cannot be seen controls everything, what hope is there for understanding at all? Chapter 8. A Locked Room's Deadly Secret Father. Brown stepped into the Manor's upper hall, only to realise with a jolt that the room ahead had held a scream he could still feel vibrating through his chest, and yet the door was locked from the inside, untouched, impossible. And within it, a death had occurred that defied every law of reason he had ever known. The air hung thick with an invisible weight, charged with the residue of violence, yet no weapon was visible, no struggle evident, no human hand left a trace. Father Brown paused, sensing that what he was about to confront would twist his understanding of reality itself, and perhaps destroy the fragile peace of his own mind. The scene had been reported earlier by the household staff, a room sealed completely, windows latched, a key in the lock that hadn't turned since the previous morning, and inside, the lifeless body of Lady Carrington. She had been found slumped in her chair, her face pale but expressionless, her hands resting on the table as if in mid-conversation with someone unseen. Nothing in the room suggested violence. No blood, no marks, no weapon, no struggle. Yet, she was undeniably dead, and the room's locked condition meant that no one could have entered or exited unnoticed. Father Brown's first instinct was disbelief. Locked room murders had fascinated the greatest detectives for decades, but this was beyond any conventional explanation. He surveyed the chamber carefully. The fireplace was cold, the curtains untouched, the floor immaculate. A faint scent of almond hung in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible. He frowned, noting that it could have been poison, but no vial, no bottle, no trace remained. It was as if the very act of death had been orchestrated with such precision that it left behind nothing tangible, only the echo of the impossible. The staff hovered outside the door, whispering amongst themselves. Their fear was palpable, their eyes wide, their hands wringing nervously. "Father, she was in there all night," one maid stammered. We heard nothing at all. And in the morning, she was like this." Father Brown nodded gravely, acknowledging the human dimension of terror. This was not merely a puzzle of mechanics or motive. It was a psychological assault, designed to unnerve, to destabilize, and to push anyone who approached the room to the brink of despair. He examined Lady Carrington's body, searching for the smallest anomaly. Her skin was cold, but intact. Her posture suggested sudden stillness rather than prolonged illness. Father Brown's fingers hovered near her wrist, testing for pulse, for warmth, for any sign that could anchor her in the physical world. But there was nothing. And yet, her death was real, and its setting, a perfectly locked room, presented a paradox he could not yet unravel. He noted every detail: the positioning of the chair, the slight indentation in the carpet, the table's immaculate surface, the faint reflection of light in the polished wood. These were not just clues, they were footprints of a mind that had orchestrated perfection in death. He turned his attention to the door itself. The lock had not been tampered with, the key was present, and the hinges bore no signs of forced entry. How could anyone have entered or exited? How could death have been delivered without contact, without action visible to witnesses? Father Brown considered every theory: mechanical trick, hidden passage, secret mechanism. But each collapsed under scrutiny. The room's integrity was absolute, yet within it, a life had ended. The contradiction gnawed at him, raising questions about what was truly possible in the physical world. Suspecting the psychological dimension of the crime, Father Brown interviewed the household again, probing for inconsistencies, for minute signs of deception. He learned that Lady Carrington had received visitors the previous evening, unremarkable in themselves, yet each account contained subtle differences. Names were misremembered, times conflicted, gestures described differently. These discrepancies were not overt. They were faint, almost imperceptible, yet they suggested manipulation, the subtle orchestration of perception to hide the unseen hand responsible for the death. Father Brown's investigation took him to the library, where Lady Carrington had spent hours prior to her death. Books were arranged meticulously, but he noticed slight displacements. One book marginally askew, a piece of paper not aligned, a shadow that fell strangely against the shelf. It was as if the room itself was speaking, offering hints to those capable of observing with patience and care. He traced the subtle irregularities, building a mental map of intention, aware that the perpetrator had anticipated every move, every glance, every question. As Father Brown retraced Lady Carrington's steps, he became aware of another layer, the psychological terror imposed on witnesses. The household had not merely observed a locked-room death. They had been participants in a subtle manipulation of fear. Every creak of the floorboard, every shift of shadow, every whisper in the corridor had been orchestrated to heighten anxiety, to obscure reality, and to divert attention from the true mechanism of death. The killer had weaponized perception itself. Hours of scrutiny revealed a faint trail of an almond scent, imperceptible to most, but detectable to a mind honed in observation. Father Brown noted that it led to a small vial previously hidden in the folds of a curtain tassel. The poison, cyanide, potent and precise, had been administered in a manner so subtle that no one could trace it to a human hand without extraordinary scrutiny. The death, though seemingly magical, had been engineered by intellect, patience, and absolute knowledge of human perception. The first big reveal struck Father Brown with staggering force. The locked-room mystery was not created by supernatural means, but by meticulous planning, an understanding of the household's routines, and psychological manipulation so advanced that the physical act of murder became almost irrelevant. The killer had ensured that every eye, every witness, every mind interpreted the room as sealed, untouched, impossible. Yet the truth lay not in the impossibility, but in the orchestration behind it, a deadly secret embedded in every precise motion, every calculated detail, every psychological cue. Father Brown confronted the staff, once more guiding them through his observations, noting the faint traces, the alignment of objects, the subtle manipulations of perception. He watched their reactions closely. Some were fearful, others incredulous, but all were compelled to reconsider what they had seen, to accept that reality was far more malleable than they had imagined. And in this reconsideration, Father Brown sensed the echo of the killer's design, a demonstration not merely of murder, but of mastery over comprehension itself. He returned to the room alone, studying it with meticulous care. The chair, the table, the window, the lock, the faint residue of scent, all told a story that was invisible to casual observation. Lady Carrington's death was precise, deliberate, yet layered with deception so subtle that it obscured both method and motive. Father Brown realized that the killer was not satisfied with mere death. They had orchestrated an event that questioned certainty, trust, and the reliability of perception. As night deepened, Father Brown reviewed the evidence again. The locked room, the perfect placement of objects, the unseen administration of poison, the manipulation of witnesses, each element confirmed the depth of the perpetrator's intellect. The killer had exploited human assumption, the expectation of normality, the confidence in what is seen, to create a tableau of impossibility. And yet, the solution, once discerned, revealed not magic, but the terrifying precision of mind over matter. Then came the cliffhanger moment that would haunt every observer. Father Brown discovered a letter hidden behind the wainscoting, written by Lady Carrington herself. The contents were cryptic. "The door locks itself, yet I do not leave. The hand that waits is unseen. Trust not what is present. Trust only what is absent." Father Brown read it again and again, realizing that the lady had understood part of the truth before her death, that her killer had engineered the perception of impossibility, leaving clues only to minds capable of extraordinary observation. Father Brown left the manor at dawn, the morning mist curling around him like whispered threats. He knew that the locked room death, though explained in mechanics and psychology, left a deeper terror unresolved. The killer's mastery over perception meant that every step forward was uncertain, every observation suspect, and every reality vulnerable to manipulation. He whispered to himself, "I know who did it." But the truth, the full truth, will never be told. The village woke unaware, yet Father Brown carried the weight of unseen calculations, hidden threats, and a secret that could unravel comprehension itself. The room remained locked, silent, perfect, but beneath its surface the deadly secret pulsed, a reminder that mastery over perception was as lethal as any weapon, and that the unseen orchestrator's hand was always near, shaping events with precision, cruelty, and inevitability. Chapter 9. Father Brown unmasks hidden killer. Father Brown froze in the dim light of the library, realizing with a shock that the killer had been standing among them all along, invisible not to the eye but to the mind, hiding in plain sight while weaving a web of lies so intricate that the very air seemed complicit in concealing them. Every glance, every word spoken in that room now seemed loaded with deception, and the realization that a murderer's hand had orchestrated every small event, every whispered doubt, every fearful glance sent a chill crawling down his spine. This was no ordinary case, no simple misdirection. It was a psychological trap laid with patience and precision, demanding not only observation, but intuition beyond normal human measure. The mystery had been mounting for weeks. Disappearances, vanishing corpses, locked-room deaths, impossible alibis, all threads of a tapestry designed to confuse, terrify, and mislead. Father Brown knew that somewhere among the household and their visitors someone had manipulated every outcome, exploited every weakness, and ensured that the truth remained hidden until he could decipher the patterns of subtle control. Now the invisible veil was lifting, revealing glimpses of a mind so cunning that it had used human trust, fear, and expectation as weapons. He began by recounting the last several incidents to himself, noting consistencies and inconsistencies alike. The maid who claimed she had seen nothing, the gardener whose story changed with each telling, the housekeeper who stumbled over her words at crucial moments, all had contributed to the atmosphere of terror and confusion. And yet, Father Brown noticed a subtle thread running through each account, a tiny, almost imperceptible sign of observation, a hesitation, a shadow of knowledge that pointed not to error, but to intent. Someone had been controlling the narrative from within, guiding perception while remaining hidden, shaping events to their advantage. Father Brown's gaze settled on the drawing room where the most recent murder had occurred, a death that had seemed impossible, occurring in a room sealed from every side. He carefully retraced the steps of those present that evening, noting movements, glances, and spoken words. The killer's strategy was clear now: exploit human assumptions, manipulate attention, and allow the mind to fill gaps with false certainties. Every contradiction, every misremembered detail, every tension-filled silence had been meticulously orchestrated to obscure the truth. He revisited Lady Carrington's letters, the notes she had left behind before her mysterious demise. Hidden within their careful wording were subtle hints, times, phrases, and repeated motifs that pointed to patterns overlooked by those too focused on the obvious. Father Brown realized that Lady Carrington had recognized the presence of the hidden killer, had tried to encode warnings in seemingly mundane observations, and had been silenced before she could reveal the truth fully. The brilliance of the killer lay in anticipating such actions, predicting attempts to uncover them, and closing every avenue before exposure. As Father Brown analyzed the sequence of events, he noticed a chilling psychological technique. The killer had exploited not only physical space, but the human mind. Fear, expectation, doubt, all were instruments of control. The invisible manipulator had orchestrated tension so perfectly that witnesses were as much part of the crime as the perpetrator, trapped in a maze of their own perception, unsure of what was real and what had been engineered. Father Brown's task was now not merely to identify the killer, but to reconstruct a sequence so meticulously disguised that every truth seemed suspect. He retraced conversations, focusing on subtle inconsistencies. Who remembered seeing whom, and at what time? Who spoke when, and how did the words influence the other's recollections? Patterns emerged in the way. Attention had been directed, moments of distraction exploited, and ordinary routines twisted into instruments of concealment. The killer had known exactly how each mind would react, how each expectation could be manipulated, and how to construct an impenetrable cloak of normality over a series of horrifying acts. Father Brown noticed the first glaring clue that would unravel the hidden killer's design. A small slip of memory from a guest, a detail so trivial it might have been ignored. A shadow, where it should not have been. A sound misattributed to a clock. A slight misalignment in a chair's placement. By itself, the observation was meaningless, but viewed in the broader context, it was a breadcrumb left by a mind under extraordinary pressure, an unintentional reveal that betrayed knowledge of the killer's proximity and actions. Father Brown knew that following this thread could expose the manipulator, but it required absolute attention, patience, and courage. He returned to the crime scenes, meticulously reconstructing the timeline with the precision of a surgeon. Every door, every window, every corridor was measured against witness statements and subtle signs, scratches, footprints, minor displacements of objects. And everywhere he looked, he felt the killer's invisible influence, a presence shaping each event, orchestrating each reaction, and ensuring that perception remained distorted. Yet the inconsistencies, the almost imperceptible errors, offered a pattern for the observant mind to follow. Then came the first big reveal. The killer was not hidden in shadow or behind locked doors. They had been present among the household, interacting, observing, influencing every action, and yet never detected. The realization struck Father Brown with staggering clarity. The murderer's brilliance lay not in concealment of location, but in concealment of intention, the ability to act without ever betraying motive, leaving only the illusion of normality while constructing an elaborate web of fear and confusion. Father Brown focused on psychological subtleties, the way certain individuals reacted to specific questions, how hesitation and misremembered details were provoked, and how attention was directed to insignificant matters while the critical actions occurred unnoticed. The hidden killer's strategy was masterful. Every act was double-layered, combining the physical and psychological so seamlessly that discovery by ordinary means was impossible. The invisible presence he had confronted in earlier chapters was now revealed not as supernatural but as meticulous calculation. human intellect operating at a level most could not comprehend. Hours passed as Father Brown pieced together the evidence, reconstructing moments that had seemed isolated and inexplicable. The previously vanishing corpse, the locked room deaths, the impossible alibis, all connected under a single logic, once the observer's mind adjusted to the killer's extraordinary methods. And, yet, even as the pattern emerged, doubt gnawed at him. Could he trust his own perception after weeks of manipulation? Had the killer anticipated this very recognition, leaving a final, ultimate deception to mask the final truth? He convened the household, methodically guiding them through inconsistencies, subtle shifts, and faint traces that had been overlooked. Reactions were intense: shock, fear, denial, and glimpses of understanding. Father Brown watched carefully, noting those whose discomfort betrayed knowledge or complicity. It was a psychological unveiling as much as a factual one, designed to expose not merely the acts of murder but the patterns of thought, perception, and manipulation that had allowed the crimes to persist unseen. Then, the final moment of confrontation arrived. Father Brown turned to the individual whose reactions, whose misalignments of speech, gestures, and attention revealed everything: the hidden killer. The person's calmness, previously mistaken for innocence, now radiated malice and cunning. Every interaction, every subtle distortion, every tiny manipulation now converged in a horrifying clarity. The murderer had been orchestrating not just the deaths, but the entire perception of reality around them. The audience, both within the manor and those following the events, were compelled to re-evaluate everything they thought they knew. Father Brown stepped closer, his voice calm but edged with authority. "I see now what you have done," he said. "Every act, every misdirection, every death, you orchestrated it all, hidden in plain sight. And yet, the truth cannot be undone, even if it is hard to believe." The killer's gaze did not falter. A faint smile suggested triumph, perhaps pride in the artistry of their deception, or confidence that the next layer of manipulation remained beyond reach. The psychological depth of the crime became fully apparent. The murderer had engineered every detail, calculated every reaction, and left clues that only a mind as observant and patient as Father Brown's could decode. Yet even as the truth emerged, the final layer of uncertainty remained. Had the killer left an ultimate misdirection, a final act that would render the revelation incomplete or misleading? Father Brown realized that understanding the killer's mind was almost as perilous as confronting their actions, and that certainty might always be elusive. In the final moments, Father Brown addressed the room and the invisible audience of observers who could never fully comprehend the depth of the orchestration. "We have seen the truth," he said, "but understand this: knowing who did it does not untangle the web entirely. Some shadows remain, some motives are unknowable, and some acts are beyond ordinary comprehension." He paused, sensing the lingering tension of the hidden manipulations that had yet to be fully revealed. Then, with a measured exhale, he whispered to himself, almost as a confession, "I know who did it. But the full truth, the entirety of what has been orchestrated, will never be told." The room was silent, yet the weight of unspoken schemes, hidden intentions, and unseen calculations hung heavy. A reminder that mastery over perception was as lethal as any weapon, and that human understanding, no matter how keen, was always vulnerable to manipulation. Father Brown left the manor, the early morning mist curling around him. A cloak of uncertainty that matched the shadows he had unravelled but could not entirely dispel. The hidden killer had been unmasked, yet their genius for concealment, deception, and psychological terror remained, leaving Father Brown and all observers with the haunting recognition that some truths, though partially revealed, are never fully knowable, and that the line between understanding and illusion is razor-thin, fragile, and terrifyingly easy to cross. Chapter 10. The Room That Shouldn't Exist. Father Brown stepped into the narrow hallway of the old estate and froze, his heart hammering as he realized the wall in front of him was wrong. It shouldn't be there. A faint draught whispered through the cracks, and yet there had never been a room in this location, according to every plan, map, and memory of the house. The sensation of impossibility pressed against him, a mixture of awe and terror. How could a physical space exist where none had any reason to exist? And why had it been hidden so perfectly that only now, by some cruel twist, had it revealed itself? His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, aware that whatever lay beyond could shatter every assumption he had ever held about reality, crime, and human ingenuity. The doorway opened with a quiet creak, revealing a small, dimly lit room that smelled faintly of decay and old paper. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light from the single window, and Father Brown's eyes immediately sought evidence, any clue, any anomaly that could explain this impossible space. There was a desk, an overturned chair, stacks of documents, and a faint outline on the floor where a rug had been pulled back recently. Nothing in the architecture or decoration seemed extraordinary, but the very existence of the room, in a place it was never meant to occupy, screamed of intention and secret design. He stepped inside, careful not to disturb the subtle order. The room was eerily quiet, almost as if it had existed outside time, a place that had waited patiently for discovery. Father Brown's mind raced. How many crimes, manipulations, or deceptions could this hidden chamber have facilitated? Was it a place for planning, a secret hiding spot for the guilty, or the repository of some dark secret that would change everything he thought he knew about the murders he had been unraveling? The very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation, heavy with secrets, and he realized that the answers could be more dangerous than any weapon. Father Brown began to examine the desk, where papers lay scattered in disarray, though most seemed deliberately placed to appear chaotic. He noticed faint markings along the edges of the wood, tiny scratches, almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. They hinted at a method of concealment. Perhaps the desk itself had been moved, or maybe it concealed a hidden compartment. Every detail in this room, he realized, was designed to test observation, to see whether someone with keen eyes and patient reasoning could decode the hidden logic of a space that shouldn't exist. As he rifled through the documents, the room seemed to resist understanding. Some papers contained maps and architectural plans of the estate, but none matched the building as it actually stood. Others were notes in a cryptic hand, warnings and cryptic phrases that implied surveillance, control, and observation. One note simply read, "The room waits, but not for long. Time is measured by those who notice nothing." Father Brown's pulse quickened. He knew he was uncovering the psychological dimension of the crime, the manipulation of space and perception so precise that only the most observant could trace the killer's mind. His search revealed faint footprints along the dust-laden floor, leading from a corner near the window to a wall panel that had been slightly misaligned. Father Brown pressed his fingers to the edges and discovered a hidden latch, cleverly concealed, to blend with the paneling. With a gentle push, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passageway, dark, narrow, and suffocatingly quiet. A chill ran through Father Brown as he realized the room's purpose. It was a conduit, a secret path that allowed unseen movement throughout the estate, connecting spaces previously believed isolated. The murders, the disappearances, and the impossible alibis were suddenly placed in a terrifying new context. Father Brown's mind reeled with possibilities. The killer had engineered this space with deliberate cunning, creating a hidden corridor that enabled movements and acts that appeared impossible to observers. The room that shouldn't exist had been a stage for murder, a silent accomplice, and a place where perception itself had been manipulated to conceal guilt. And yet, even as the physical explanation emerged, the psychological terror intensified. The killer had designed the space not just to facilitate action, but to warp reality in the minds of witnesses. He followed the narrow passage, careful to leave no trace, until it opened into another corridor, one he had walked countless times, but which now seemed subtly altered. Father Brown noted faint scuff marks, slight shifts in dust, and the lingering scent of almond, an olfactory trace of poison previously used in the deaths. The connections became horrifyingly clear. The killer had exploited architectural knowledge, psychological insight, and precise timing to execute crimes that appeared supernatural, untraceable, and impossible. Every room, every hallway, every observed movement was a component of a masterful orchestration. Returning to the hidden room, Father Brown discovered more evidence. A series of journals, meticulously coded, detailing previous murders, misdirections, and manipulations. The handwriting was careful, controlled, almost obsessive in precision. Each entry was a chronicle of intent, cataloguing every witness, every reaction, and every perceived assumption. The killer had been not merely a murderer, but a manipulator of reality itself, recording acts and anticipating every investigative move. Father Brown realized he was reading the mind of a criminal genius, someone whose intellect rivaled his own observational skills, yet who wielded them in the service of darkness. As he studied the journals, he uncovered a reference to a final act, a culmination of hidden movements and unseen calculations. The final act, it seemed, was designed to test the limits of perception, to confound even the most astute observer, and to leave death shrouded in ambiguity. Father Brown's pulse quickened. The killer had anticipated not just the immediate investigations, but the very unraveling of their own mind, leaving puzzles within puzzles, a labyrinthine construction meant to obscure truth indefinitely. Father Brown returned to the main hall, piecing together the implications of the hidden room. Every previous murder, disappearance, and impossible alibi suddenly fell into place, linked through the secret corridors and concealed spaces. The killer's brilliance lay in anticipation. Each act was choreographed to exploit human assumptions, to manipulate perception, and to leave observers doubting their own senses. Yet, even with this realization, the danger remained. The killer could act again, using spaces unseen, manipulating reality, and remaining undetected. He convened the household, explaining the existence of the secret room and its implications. Reactions were immediate: fear, disbelief, and a creeping sense of panic. Father Brown noted who trembled, who avoided eye contact, who reacted with subtle unease, each a potential witness, accomplice, or even perpetrator. The hidden room had not merely concealed actions, it had concealed truth, shaping the emotional and psychological state of everyone in the house. The very awareness of the room's existence now became part of the killer's weaponry, a tool to manipulate and terrify. Father Brown's investigation revealed yet another layer. The room contained a series of small, deliberate imperfections, barely perceptible to ordinary observation. The placement of furniture, the angles of light, the faint sounds carried through hidden gaps, all orchestrated to create confusion, misdirection, and psychological tension. The killer had exploited the human mind's reliance on spatial logic, perception, and expectation, creating a reality within which impossibilities seemed natural and ordinary events became instruments of terror. Hours passed as Father Brown reconstructed the room's design and purpose. Every measurement, every scratch, every shadow, every smell was accounted for, and yet the full depth of the killer's manipulation remained elusive. He realized that the room had been a testing ground, a laboratory for psychological control, and that every act committed within it was designed not only to execute murder, but to exert mastery over perception itself. The implications were terrifying. The killer had achieved a level of control over reality, over observation, over the minds of others that bordered on the incomprehensible. Then came the first shocking revelation. One of the seemingly innocuous servants had been aware of the room, moving through it, exploiting it, yet concealing knowledge with meticulous care. Father Brown confronted them subtly, noting hesitations, micro-expressions, and minor inconsistencies. The servants' role was not merely passive. They had participated in the orchestration, maintaining the illusion of impossibility while assisting in unseen actions. The psychological depth of this collaboration intensified the horror. The crimes had been executed with not only genius but complicity, ensuring that discovery remained nearly impossible. Father Brown pieced together the final clues: the alignment of the hidden passages, the traces of movement, the journals detailing intent, and the subtle, psychological manipulations. The room that shouldn't exist had been both physical and conceptual, a mechanism by which the killer manipulated space, perception, and time itself. And yet, even as he understood the mechanics, the ultimate motive remained obscured, leaving him, the household, and any observer grappling with the profound uncertainty of human ingenuity employed for destruction. In the final moments, Father Brown addressed the household. The room that shouldn't exist has been revealed. But understand this, its secrets are deeper than walls and corridors. They lie in calculation, in anticipation, in the manipulation of what we believe is real. The killer remains among us, not only in body but in the orchestration of perception. The room itself seemed to echo his words, a silent witness to acts and intentions concealed for years. As he departed the estate, Father Brown reflected on the chilling revelation. The hidden room had been both weapon and theatre, designed to... Chapter 11. Father Brown Solves Death Puzzle. The first thing Father Brown saw when he entered the study was a single envelope lying atop the desk, sealed with a blood-red wax stamp that bore an emblem he did not recognize. But the moment his fingers brushed it, a chill ran down his spine, for he knew with absolute certainty that this letter held the answer to a death that should have been impossible to solve. The room smelled faintly of burnt parchment and cold metal, an odd combination that made his stomach turn, and the shadows in the corners seemed to lean toward him, as if they had been waiting for this moment of revelation. Every instinct in him screamed that opening the envelope would change everything. It might reveal the truth, but it could also unravel the fragile boundary between comprehension and madness. Father Brown's eyes scanned the room, taking in details he had somehow missed before. The desk was unusually heavy, the wood polished to a sinister sheen, and faint scratches etched along the drawers suggested that someone had moved or concealed something within it recently. A chair was positioned slightly off-angle, almost as if it had been shoved back in a hurry, and he noticed a faint indentation on the floor where a small object had rested. These subtle clues whispered of meticulous planning, manipulation, and a mind that delighted in leaving riddles instead of confessions. He realized instantly that the envelope was not merely a clue, it was the linchpin of a master plan that had spanned months, perhaps years. He broke the seal, the wax cracking under his thumb, and unfolded the parchment within. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, almost cruelly elegant, as though each letter had been chosen to mock the reader while revealing the bare minimum of truth. The message was cryptic, a labyrinth of words designed to mislead even the most careful observer. Father Brown's eyes narrowed, scanning line after line, each phrase a puzzle, a hidden meaning, layered atop another, until he felt the room itself closing in, the walls pressing secrets into his mind like an impossible riddle. The puzzle was immediate, a weaving of locations, times, and psychological triggers. The writer knew precisely how Father Brown's mind would approach the problem, anticipating every logical step and creating diversions meant to make the solution appear unattainable. He realized the killer, or architect of this puzzle, was not merely trying to hide a crime. They were testing him, drawing him into a psychological duel, and the stakes were higher than any ordinary murder case. Every detail, every word, every implied threat was calibrated to unnerve, confuse, and control. Father Brown began retracing the timeline of the deaths, each incident previously considered discrete and inexplicable now, aligning in a sinister pattern he had never imagined. There were repeated motifs. A missing candle, the same faint scent of almond near the scene, subtle scratches on furniture, tiny traces of dust displaced in ways that suggested precise movements, invisible to ordinary witnesses. The puzzle within the letter was meant to direct attention, but also to obscure it. The more he looked, the more he realized how carefully orchestrated every crime had been, as though a meticulous hand had moved the pieces across a vast chessboard without leaving a single obvious trace. He noticed a peculiar reference in the letter to the hour of the shadow, a phrase that initially seemed poetic but slowly revealed a method. The timing of the murders, the shifts of light and darkness, and the manipulation of human perception were all critical elements in a larger, more terrifying design. The killer had not only executed murders with precision, but had also created a psychological maze, using light, sound, and expectation as instruments of fear and misdirection. Father Brown felt a growing sense of unease. The killer's intelligence was not merely criminal. It was almost pathological, merging genius with malevolence. In examining the letter further, he discovered a series of marginal notes, barely visible, coded in faint pencil strokes, coordinates, times, and cryptic symbols that pointed to locations within the estate he had not yet explored. Father Brown's pulse quickened. He realized these annotations were not merely hints, but a map, a carefully disguised guide to understanding the entire sequence of deaths. The puzzle, once abstract, began to take a tangible shape, but the clarity brought not relief but dread. Each revelation suggested another layer of manipulation, another hidden act, another cruel twist awaiting discovery. Father Brown moved through the house following the cryptic instructions from the letter. Each room contained subtle anomalies. Furniture slightly misaligned, windows left open just enough to create drafts. Faint footprints in dust that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. He understood that these were not mistakes. They were deliberate provocations, guiding him toward the solution while simultaneously disorienting him. The killer had engineered the very environment to become an extension of the puzzle, ensuring that any observer would constantly question the reality of what they saw. At the center of the house, he discovered an empty safe, the combination long removed, yet with faint scratches suggesting recent use. Father Brown carefully examined the interior and found a stack of papers wrapped in oilskin, each documenting previous murders, alibis, and the psychological responses of witnesses. Every page revealed a meticulous study of human behavior, each crime recorded not only as an act, but as a social experiment in manipulation, perception, and control. The envelope in his hand suddenly made perfect sense. It was both the key and the challenge, an invitation to enter the killer's mind while risking his own sanity. He noticed the pattern emerging. The deaths, previously thought isolated, were connected through a complex web of timing, architecture, and human psychology. The letter, once indecipherable, now revealed subtle instructions on how to trace the connections. Father Brown's mind worked furiously, reconstructing the sequence of events, realizing that the killer had anticipated every investigative move, leaving traps and dead ends intended to frustrate him. The psychological complexity was staggering. Each revelation provoked not understanding but more questions, and the weight of this knowledge pressed against Father Brown's reason. The first major revelation struck him like a physical blow. One of the household staff, previously deemed innocent, had been complicit in setting up the intricate mechanisms of the murders, guiding events from behind the scenes while remaining in plain sight. The realization was horrifying. It meant that the killer had allies, and that deception was a household-wide conspiracy. Every gesture, every seemingly mundane act, now carried significance, and Father Brown understood that even the smallest lapse in attention could have catastrophic consequences. The letter hinted at an ultimate confrontation, a place where the final piece of the puzzle could be solved, but warned of a danger so subtle and insidious that any misstep could render all reasoning useless. Father Brown moved carefully, tracing the path suggested in the marginalia, his mind racing to anticipate what traps might have been set, what misdirections awaited him. The air grew colder, shadows longer, and the sense of an unseen presence intensified. It was as though the house itself had become an instrument in the killer's psychological game, each element perfectly tuned to provoke uncertainty and fear. He discovered a small hidden compartment in the floorboards beneath the study desk, concealed with extraordinary precision. Inside lay a collection of objects, each seemingly innocuous, but each carrying critical information. A watch stopped at an exact time, a shard of glass with a fingerprint, a journal entry meticulously noting each person's movements on a specific night. These items, when analysed in conjunction with the cryptic instructions of the letter, revealed the timeline of the murders and, more terrifyingly, the method by which the killer had manipulated perception to create impossible alibis. Father Brown realised that the envelope was more than evidence. It was a psychological mirror, forcing him to reconstruct events with extreme care while simultaneously confronting the limits of his own understanding. The killer had anticipated observation, deduction, and even doubt, crafting a scenario in which the very act of seeking truth became a test of the investigator's mind. Every step Father Brown took revealed another layer of deception, a more sophisticated twist, another trap waiting to ensnare him. The final revelation arrived in a moment of almost unbearable tension. The murderer had used the house itself as an accomplice, creating a network of hidden passages, manipulated lighting, and carefully timed distractions to make certain deaths appear instantaneous, impossible, or untraceable. The puzzle was both mechanical and psychological. The killings had been orchestrated to exploit the assumptions, fears, and expectations of every observer, leaving chaos and uncertainty in their wake. Father Brown felt the gravity of this genius and cruelty, knowing that to solve the puzzle was to confront the full extent of human cunning applied to malevolent ends. Yet, even with the solution in his grasp, uncertainty lingered. The final act, referenced in the letter, remained unresolved, its outcome dependent on choices he had not yet made. Father Brown understood that the killer had built contingencies into every scenario, ensuring that even discovery would not bring closure, but only further layers of revelation and ambiguity. The puzzle, he realized, was infinite in its psychological depth. Each answer led to more questions, each solution to more peril. As he prepared to confront the final element of the puzzle, Father Brown paused and reflected on the magnitude of what he had uncovered. The letter had guided him through a labyrinth of murder, manipulation, and psychological terror. Each revelation had been shocking, disorienting, and morally unsettling. The very act of understanding had placed him at the edge of comprehension, teetering between clarity and madness, and the final confrontation promised to push him even further. He gathered the documents, noting their hidden connections, and whispered to himself, "The puzzle is solved, yet the truth remains a shadow, hidden in plain sight. I know the path, but the full measure of its horror may never be understood." The house seemed to respond to his words, the walls murmuring secrets, the shadows shifting with intent, and the final piece of the death puzzle loomed ahead, unresolved, threatening, and nearly beyond belief. Father Brown knew with chilling certainty that solving this puzzle had brought him to the precipice of revelation, yet the ultimate truth, who had orchestrated it, why, and with what full measure of intent, remained shrouded in darkness. The envelope had unlocked the path, but it had also illuminated the terrifying complexity of human cunning, leaving him aware that understanding and horror were inseparable in this deadly design. The final question hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Could any truth fully encompass the scope of such a calculated, multi-layered evil? Father Brown's voice, soft but resolute, broke the silence. "I know who did it, and yet the totality of their design will never be fully revealed." He folded the letter carefully, aware that its contents were both the key and the curse, and stepped away from the desk, the weight of comprehension pressing heavily upon him, the mystery lingering, unresolved, and infinitely compelling. Chapter 12. A Murder. No one witnessed. The moment Father Brown stepped into the silent drawing room, he was met with a scene so unsettling that it seemed almost unreal. A man lay sprawled across the oriental rug, his eyes wide with the frozen terror of the last second. Yet there was no weapon, no sign of struggle, and no witness who could explain how this horror had come to pass. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood mingled with the faint scent of lavender, an incongruous mixture that twisted his stomach and sharpened his senses. Something had happened here that defied explanation. A perfect crime not only in execution, but in its uncanny ability to remain entirely unseen. A phantom act of violence that mocked reason itself. Father Brown circled the room, his eyes darting to every shadow, every imperfection in the fabric of the surroundings. The windows were tightly shut, the heavy curtains drawn as if to seal in some secret the world could never witness. The clock ticked, loudly, each chime echoing against the walls like a metronome for a dance of death. It was a murder meticulously orchestrated, yet there was no signature, no clue, save for the final expression of the victim, a mixture of shock realization and horror that seemed to accuse the very air itself. He knelt by the body, noting details that might have escaped a less careful observer. The victim's hands were unnaturally relaxed, palms open, fingers slightly curled, as if he had expected someone, or something, to appear. The rug bore subtle impressions almost invisible, suggesting a weight shifted or an object pressed down with precise intent. The fireplace emitted a soft, residual heat. Ash clung faintly to the edges of the hearth, a silent witness to events that no one had actually seen. Every element in the room whispered a story, yet each clue pulled him in contradictory directions, making certainty seem impossibly distant. Father Brown's mind raced as he reconstructed the hours leading up to the murder. Everyone in the house had alibis that seemed airtight, servants recounting their duties, guests describing their conversations, and even the caretaker of the estate producing receipts, notes, and time-stamped letters. Yet something did not align. The murder had occurred in the very heart of the home, at a time when every person had been accounted for, or so it seemed. The possibility that this death was not only clever, but deliberately unsolvable, began to gnaw at him, feeding a growing sense of dread that every step toward truth might only deepen the enigma. As he examined the room more closely, he noticed minute inconsistencies that would have been invisible to anyone else. A slight discoloration on the wallpaper near the mantel, a faint scuff on the polished wood floor, and an imperceptible shift in the weight of the furniture that suggested movement without human contact. Father Brown realized with a chill that the murder had been executed using knowledge of physics, timing, and human psychology in a way that transformed the room itself into an instrument of death. The killer had engineered not only the act, but the perception of impossibility, a design that would leave investigators questioning reality itself. He reached for the letter left by the previous victim, the envelope trembling slightly in his hands, aware that it might contain the thread to unravel the entire sequence of murders. The writing was familiar, yet the tone was harsher, more urgent than before, almost pleading for understanding. The letter referenced unseen forces, shadows that move between minds, and the hand that strikes without being touched. Father Brown read it over and over, each line both illuminating and deepening the mystery, hinting at an intelligence that thrived on secrecy and the impossibility of human comprehension. He turned his attention to the fireplace, noting the ash and the faint imprint of a small object that had been hastily removed. Could this have been the mechanism of death? Something that left no mark, no noise, no trace. The complexity of it seemed to suggest the killer was not merely skilled, but obsessively meticulous, someone who understood human expectations and exploited them ruthlessly. Father Brown's heart raced as he considered that every previous murder might have been a rehearsal for this final perfect act, a demonstration of mastery over both life and perception. Father Brown examined the doors and windows again, searching for hidden compartments, loose panels, or anything that might conceal a device, a mechanism, or even a trap. Nothing visible appeared to explain the impossibility of the murder, but he noticed a subtle distortion in the reflection of the mirror across the room. The angle of light created an illusion of emptiness, yet it hinted at something lying outside of direct sight. He bent closer, straining his eyes, aware that the smallest detail could hold the key to understanding what had transpired. He retraced the steps of the household staff and guests, carefully questioning timelines, noting contradictions and ambiguities. Each account seemed reliable, yet Father Brown sensed the lies interwoven with truths, the delicate misdirection that had allowed the crime to occur without observation. He realized that the killer had studied human behavior with an almost scientific precision, knowing how fear, habit, and attention could be manipulated to create a scene of death that remained entirely invisible in execution and explanation. As Father Brown delved deeper into the room, he noticed an almost imperceptible pattern in the arrangement of objects, the positioning of furniture, the alignment of the books on the shelves, the tilt of the picture frames. Each element seemed trivial, yet collectively they formed a subtle diagram, a map designed to guide perception while concealing the fatal act. The killer had transformed the environment itself into a tool, orchestrating death with an artistry that combined spatial awareness, timing, and an understanding of the human mind that was terrifying in its precision. He found a note tucked behind the fireplace tools, its edges singed as though it had survived a minor fire. The words were fragmented, cryptic, but they spoke of timing, pressure, and inevitability. The unseen hand governs all. Only in stillness will the truth reveal itself. Watch the shadow when the clock strikes twice. Father Brown understood that the murderer had left instructions, a cruel challenge to anyone who sought to understand, a puzzle embedded in both the physical world and the human psyche. Hours passed as he reconstructed the likely sequence of events. The victim had been in the room alone, yet death had arrived without a witness, without a weapon, without a mark of struggle. The room itself had been an accomplice: slight inclines in the floor, carefully balanced objects, thermal effects, and psychological manipulation combined to create a situation where death could appear sudden, invisible, and inexplicable. Father Brown felt the weight of genius in malevolence, the meticulous fusion of intellect and cruelty that left even him reeling. Then he noticed a subtle detail he had previously overlooked: a hairline crack in the ceiling moulding, perfectly aligned with a beam of light from the late afternoon sun. The alignment was precise, and it suggested that the sun's rays, at a particular angle, might trigger an effect unseen by the human eye: a reflection, a magnification, a shift in perception that would allow the fatal act to occur without physical interaction. Father Brown realized that this murder had been planned down to the last second, exploiting natural phenomena to achieve an outcome that seemed impossible. The first major revelation hit him. The killer had understood not only mechanics and physics, but psychology to an extraordinary degree. The victim had been placed in a position where instinct, expectation, and visual perception would guide him to his end, all while leaving no observable cause. Death had been achieved without direct contact, and the room itself had acted as the silent instrument. Father Brown's mind struggled to reconcile the elegance of the method with the horror of its intent. As he explored further, he discovered hidden grooves in the baseboards that suggested a mechanism of movement, small channels that could direct air, dust, or even chemical particles subtly, ensuring the victim's final moments were both controlled and unseen. Father Brown realized that the murder was as much an experiment in control and perception as it was a killing, a demonstration of power over reality itself, leaving no evidence, no witness, only the stark finality of life extinguished. He paused in the center of the room, feeling the oppressive weight of the design around him. The clues, subtle and dispersed, painted a picture of a killer who had calculated every detail, anticipated every observation, and manipulated the environment to achieve the ultimate control. Each element, the furniture, the lighting, the small imperfections, was a deliberate component in a system designed to produce a murder no one could witness or comprehend fully. The second revelation was more personal. The killer had anticipated him. Father Brown realized that every step he had taken, every hypothesis he had formed, had been accounted for in the murderer's design. The crime was not only perfect in execution, but had been constructed to challenge even his formidable mind, drawing him into a psychological trap where the pursuit of truth itself became part of the test. The enormity of the manipulation was dizzying, leaving him to question what could ever truly be known. Father Brown then noticed a final, almost invisible mark on the floor, a faint discoloration that suggested a small object had been removed or shifted at the critical moment. It was a detail so minor that anyone else would have overlooked it, yet it held the key to understanding the mechanics of the death. The room had been rigged to perform an act beyond ordinary perception, using natural forces, human expectation, and psychological pressure to achieve a result that seemed impossible. He reconstructed the act in his mind, the victim positioned perfectly, the light and shadows aligned, the hidden mechanism primed, and the environment orchestrated to guide perception while delivering death silently. Every factor had been manipulated to perfection. Father Brown's pulse quickened as he realized the terrifying brilliance of the plan. The murderer had created a death no one could witness, a crime that transcended ordinary methods, leaving only shock, horror, and an impossible puzzle. Yet, even as the solution became clear, the ultimate truth remained elusive. The identity of the killer, their motive, and the full scope of their planning lingered in shadow. Father Brown understood. that while he had deciphered the mechanics of the murder, the human intention behind it, the psychological cruelty, the meticulous foresight, the obsession with control, remained a mystery that could never be fully unraveled. The puzzle was complete, yet the darkness at its core remained intact. He stepped back from the body, the weight of comprehension pressing heavily on his mind. The room, silent and unyielding, seemed almost alive, holding its secrets in the angles of light, the grain of the wood, and the subtle imperfections of its construction. Father Brown whispered to himself, "I know how it was done, but the heart of the darkness, the hand that wove it all, may never be revealed." The truth, partially illuminated and partially hidden, left him with a profound sense of awe, dread, and uncertainty. A reminder that some crimes are so cunning, so perfectly conceived, that they defy not only justice, but human understanding. Even as he left the room, closing the door behind him, Father Brown felt the lingering presence of the murder, a shadow that would haunt his thoughts, challenging every assumption and leaving him forever aware that some truths, no matter how closely examined, remain beyond the reach of even the keenest mind. The puzzle was solved in mechanics, but the ultimate terror, the knowledge that a death could be so complete, so invisible and so inescapable, remained, and would never truly be forgotten. The last words he muttered, almost to himself, almost to the room, carried the weight of the unspeakable. "I know who did it, yet the truth will never be fully told, and perhaps it was never meant to be."